In January of 1847, a man named Thomas Southwick walked out onto the frozen Hudson River just north of Albany. The temperature was 4 degrees below zero. The ice beneath his boots was 16 inches thick, solid enough to hold a locomotive. He carried an ice saw that weighed 11 pounds, and by the end of that day, he would cut nearly 40 tons of ice from that river with nothing but his arms, his back, and a tool that hadn't changed much since the 1820s. Thomas Southwick earned $2 for that day's work, and somewhere in the city of New York, a wealthy family would pay 50 cents for a single block of that ice to keep their butter cold for a week. This is the story of the men who froze America before refrigerators existed, the ones who waded into rivers at dawn when the air burned their lungs, the ones whose horses drowned when the ice cracked without warning, the ones whose names you've never heard, who built a $200 million industry with handsaws and brute force, then watched it disappear within 20 years. Before we had machines that made coal, we had to steal it from nature, and the men who did that stealing paid for it with their bodies. To understand what ice meant to America, you have to understand what life was like without it. And I mean, really understand it, not just intellectually, but in your gut. Imagine it's August in New York City, 1830. You're a housewife living in a tenement on the Lower East Side. The air in your apartment hasn't moved in days. The walls radiate heat from morning until well after midnight. You bought milk yesterday from a farmer who brought it in by cart from outside the city. By the time you wake up this morning, that milk has turned, it's curdled, it smells like something died in the bottle. You pour it out because there's nothing else you can do. The meat you bought 3 days ago, the pork shoulder that cost you a full day's wages, has gone green around the edges. You cut away the bad parts with a knife and hope the rest won't make your children sick. Sometimes it does. Sometimes children die from eating spoiled food, and nobody calls it a tragedy, because it happens so often that it's just part of life. Every mother knew another mother who had buried a child to summer sickness. It was expected. It was normal. Fresh vegetables rot within days. Butter turns rancid in the summer heat, becoming inedible within hours of leaving the root cellar. Fish becomes dangerous within hours of being caught. The wealthy solve this problem by buying fresh food every single day, sending servants to market each morning before dawn. The poor eat what they can afford and pray it doesn't kill them. Doctors estimated that in the 1830s, nearly a quarter of all childhood deaths in American cities could be traced to contaminated food. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery swept through neighborhoods every summer like clockwork. The heat wasn't just uncomfortable, it was lethal. And everyone knew it, but knowing changed nothing. You couldn't afford fresh food every day. You couldn't afford an underground cellar. You ate what was available and took your chances. This was the world before ice became a commodity. A world where food was a daily negotiation with decay, where summer meant sickness, where keeping things cold was a luxury reserved for the very rich, who could afford to build elaborate underground storage or import ice from hundreds of miles away at prices that would bankrupt a working family. And then a young man from Boston had an idea that everyone thought was insane. Frederick Tudor was born in 1783 to a wealthy Boston family. His father was a lawyer, his brothers were destined for Harvard, and Frederick was supposed to follow the same respectable path into the professional class. He didn't. At 22 years old, Frederick Tudor announced that he was going to cut ice from the ponds around Boston and ship it to the Caribbean. He was going to sell frozen water to people living in the tropics. His family thought he'd lost his mind. His friends thought it was a joke that had gone too far. The newspapers mocked him openly. One Boston paper ran a story suggesting that Tudor might as well try to ship sunshine to the equator. The entire venture seemed so absurd that when Tudor tried to book passage on a cargo ship, no captain would take him. They didn't want to be associated with what looked like obvious madness. They thought he'd damage their reputations. Tudor's own brother wrote in his journal that Frederick had become obsessed with a fantasy, that the family should prepare for financial ruin. His mother wept openly at family dinners. His father stopped speaking to him for months. His business partners, what few he had, quietly distanced themselves from the venture and pretended they'd never been involved. But Tudor wasn't crazy. He was obsessed, yes. Stubborn beyond reason, certainly, but not crazy. So he had visited the Caribbean and watched wealthy plantation owners pay enormous sums for any cold drink they could get. He had seen how they treasured the rare blocks of ice that occasionally arrived from northern ports. He had done the math. Ice cost almost nothing to harvest in New England. It fell from the sky for free, formed on every pond and lake without any human effort at all. All you had to do was cut it, store it, and transport it. If even half the ice survived the voyage, he would make a fortune. So Tudor did what obsessed men do. He bought his own ship when no one would rent him cargo space. He borrowed money from everyone who would lend it to him, and some who wouldn't, but felt sorry for him anyway. He personally supervised the cutting of 130 tons of ice from his family's pond in Saugus, Massachusetts. And in February of 1806, he set sail for the island of Martinique. The voyage took 3 weeks. By the time Tudor arrived in the Caribbean, most of his ice had melted. The insulation methods he'd used were completely inadequate. The tropical sun beat down on the ship's hold. Water pooled in the bottom of the cargo bay. What remained of his ice was perhaps a quarter of what he'd started with, already soft around the edges and shrinking by the hour. But even that fraction was enough to create a brief sensation among the wealthy colonists, who paid handsomely for cold drinks and ice cream. Tudor made some money, but nowhere near enough to cover his costs. He had lost thousands of dollars on the venture. Everyone he knew told him to cut his losses and give up. He tried again, and again, and again. He lost money on almost every voyage. By 1813, Tudor had been arrested for debt twice. He had ruined his family's finances. He had spent years of his life chasing an idea that everyone had told him was stupid. His fiancée's family broke off the engagement, deciding they couldn't risk their daughter's future on a madman. His friends stopped answering his letters. He spent time in debtor's prison, staring at the walls and calculating how he could make the ice last longer. And here's where the story turns. Because Tudor didn't give up, he kept experimenting. He tested every insulating material he could find. He figured out that sawdust was the key, that ice packed in sawdust would last 3 times longer than ice wrapped in straw. The discovery came almost by accident. A worker had stored leftover ice in a sawmill pit, and Tudor noticed it lasted far longer than it should have. He investigated. He tested different depths of sawdust. He measured melting rates with obsessive precision. He designed new storage facilities with double walls and minimal windows, reducing the amount of warm air that could reach the ice. He developed techniques for cutting ice faster and cleaner, selecting only the clearest blocks from the center of ponds where impurities hadn't reached. He negotiated exclusive contracts with ports throughout the Caribbean and eventually India, creating a network of ice houses that would receive and store his shipments. By 1833, Frederick Tudor shipped a cargo of ice from Boston to Calcutta. The voyage took 4 months. The ice traveled 16,000 miles across 2 oceans, through tropical heat that should have melted it a dozen times over. It crossed the equator twice. It sat in the hold of a ship while sailors sweat through their clothes on deck above, and when it arrived, it was still frozen. Tudor sold it for enormous profit to British colonial officers who had never tasted anything cold in their entire lives. These men had spent years in India, dreaming of English winters, missing the simple pleasure of a cold drink on a hot day. When Tudor's ice arrived, they paid whatever he asked. Word spread throughout the colonial administration. Demand exploded. The man they had mocked as a fool became known as the Ice King. By 1856, Tudor's company was shipping 146,000 tons of ice per year to ports on 4 continents. Ships left Boston Harbor loaded with nothing but frozen water, and they returned with profits that would make a gold miner jealous. Tudor died in 1864 as one of the wealthiest men in Boston, having built an industry that hadn't existed when he was born. But Tudor was just the beginning. What he started would transform into something far larger than one man's obsession. It would become a vast industrial machine that employed tens of thousands of workers and reshaped the landscape of the American Northeast. The Hudson River became the heart of that machine. Picture the Hudson in January. The river freezes in long stretches north of Poughkeepsie, where the water runs slower and the cold settles in. The ice forms in layers. each freeze adding another inch or two of thickness. By late January, if the winter has been good, the ice is thick enough to harvest, 16 inches minimum, 20 inches is better. The companies send men out with augers to test the thickness, boring holes every few hundred feet to make sure the ice is safe. And when the ice is ready, the entire valley transforms into something that looked more like a factory floor than a natural river. At the industry's peak in the 1880s, more than 20,000 men worked the Hudson River ice harvest simultaneously. They came from the surrounding farms, from the villages along the river, from New York City itself. Some were recent immigrants who spoke no English, fresh off boats from Ireland and Germany and Italy, desperate for any work they could find. Some were freed black men who had escaped slavery a generation earlier and found their way north looking for opportunity. Some were local boys as young as 14 who lied about their age to earn money for their families during the winter months when farm work dried up. They arrived before dawn. The temperature might be 10 below zero, sometimes colder. The wind coming off the river cut through wool like it wasn't there. Your eyes watered and the tears froze on your cheeks. You could see your breath freeze in midair and fall to the ice as tiny crystals. The men stamped their feet and swung their arms to keep the blood moving, waiting for the foreman to assign their positions. The foremen were hard men. They had quotas to fill. They didn't care about frostbite or exhaustion or fear. They cared about tonnage. Every block of ice that didn't make it into the ice house was money lost. Every minute wasted was profit gone. They drove the men hard, and the men took it because the alternative was no work at all. The ice harvest had its own culture, its own rituals. The men developed a vocabulary that outsiders couldn't understand. A clean cut was called a butter slice. A dangerous thin spot was a widowmaker. When the foreman blew his whistle for the midday break, the men gathered around fires built on the shore and passed tin cups of coffee that froze over if you didn't drink it fast enough. They shared bread and dried meat, their fingers too numb to feel what they were eating. Some of these men had worked the harvest for 30 years. They remembered when the industry was smaller, when a man could know every other man on the river by name. They watched as the operations grew larger and more impersonal, as the companies consolidated and the quotas increased. They watched younger men arrive, immigrants who didn't speak English, who had never seen a frozen river in their lives. They taught those men what they could, knowing that their own bodies were failing, that soon they would be the ones replaced. The veterans had their own hierarchy. The most experienced cutters worked the center of the field, where the ice was thickest and the danger slightly less. The new men worked the edges, near the thin ice and the open water. It was a kind of apprenticeship by survival. If you made it through your first season at the edges, you earned your place closer to the center. If you didn't make it, well, there were always more men looking for work. The work began with marking. A team of men with horse-drawn plows scored the ice into a grid of perfect squares, usually 22 inches on each side. The horses wore special shoes fitted with caulks, metal spikes that bit into the ice and kept them from slipping. Even so, when horses fell through the ice every winter, some were pulled out in time shivering and terrified but alive. Others weren't. A horse that went through the ice in deep water was usually dead within minutes, drowned or frozen before anyone could reach it. The companies didn't count horse deaths. They didn't count them any more than they counted human deaths. They just bought more horses. After the marking came the cutting. This was the dangerous work, the work that killed men. The ice saw was a brutal tool. It had a blade about 5 feet long with teeth like a shark's mouth, each tooth set at an angle designed to clear ice chips from the cut. You drove it into the scored line and worked it back and forth, until you cut through to the water below. The saw weighed enough that after an hour of cutting, your shoulders burned and your arms shook. After 8 hours, some men couldn't lift their hands above their waists. After a week, their palms were raw and bleeding, the skin worn through in strips. They wrapped their hands in rags and kept cutting. There was no other choice. The real danger wasn't the exhaustion. It was the water. When you cut through 16 inches of ice, water surges up through the gap. It's so cold that it doesn't feel like water at all. It feels like liquid fire against your skin. If it splashes on your face, you have seconds to wipe it off before it freezes solid. If it soaks through your clothes, the cold penetrates to your bones within minutes. If you slip into the cut, if your foot goes through, the cold hits your nervous system like an electric shock. The pain is instantaneous and overwhelming. Men have been pulled out of the water after 30 seconds and still lost toes to frostbite. After 60 seconds, the cold reaches your core. Your muscles start to seize. Your thoughts become confused. After 2 minutes, your muscles stop responding to commands. Your body starts shutting down, prioritizing your heart and lungs over your arms and legs. The limbs go quiet. The brain follows. And some men weren't pulled out at all. In February of 1882, a worker named Patrick Mulligan was cutting ice near Catskill when the block he was standing on shifted. The ice moved without warning, tilting suddenly as the water underneath redistributed. He fell through the cut into 12 feet of black water. His co-workers tried to reach him, but the current pulled him under the ice sheet, away from the gap he'd fallen through. They could hear him pounding on the underside of the ice for almost a minute. The sound carried through the frozen surface. Then the pounding stopped. They found his body 2 weeks later, 3 miles downriver, wedged against a bridge pylon. The current had carried him under the ice until he'd fetched up against the stone. His family came to identify him. His children were ages 6, 4, and 2. Mulligan was 34 years old. He had a wife and 3 children who depended on him. He was earning $1.50 for that day's work. The ice companies kept no records of how many men died. There was no government agency tracking workplace deaths in the 1880s. No OSHA, no workers' compensation, no wrongful death lawsuits that went anywhere. When a man fell through the ice or was crushed by a shifting block or collapsed from hypothermia, and his family received nothing. Maybe the foreman passed a hat around. Maybe the other workers chipped in a few dollars from their meager wages. But there was no compensation, no insurance, no acknowledgement that the death was anything other than bad luck. The ice companies made millions. The workers made dollars. And the gap between those numbers was measured in human lives. Once the ice was cut, it had to be moved. And moving ice was its own kind of brutal art. The blocks floated in the channels between the cuts, jostling against each other like giant dominoes. Men called floaters worked the channels with long poles tipped with iron spikes, guiding the blocks toward the shore. They stood on thin platforms or balanced on the ice itself, pushing blocks that weighed 300 pounds each. One wrong step, and they were in the water. And one moment of inattention, and a block could pin them against the edge of the channel, crushing ribs or breaking legs with casual violence. The floaters developed a sixth sense for ice movement. They could feel when a jam was building upstream, when the blocks were about to shift suddenly. They learned to jump clear at the first sign of trouble, abandoning their poles and scrambling for solid ice. The ones who learned fast survived. The ones who didn't became the stories that older workers told to scare the new men into paying attention. At the shore, the blocks hit the conveyor. This was the one truly mechanical piece of the operation, a long chain of iron teeth that gripped the ice and hauled it up out of the water and into the ice house. The conveyor ran on horsepower or steam, depending on the operation, and it never stopped during harvest hours. Blocks came up the chain one after another, hundreds per hour, thousands per day. The rhythm was relentless. The sound of that conveyor became the soundtrack of the harvest. The grinding of iron on ice, the splash of water falling back into the channel, the shouts of the foreman keeping count, the occasional scream when someone got too close to the mechanism and lost a finger or a hand to the iron teeth. The men at the top of the conveyor worked the ice into stacks. They used iron hooks and raw muscle to slide each block into place. The ice houses were massive structures, some of them 4 stories tall, insulated with sawdust, and built to hold tens of thousands of tons. The air inside was perpetually cold, even in summer. Men who worked the ice houses year-round developed a constant cough from breathing sawdust and ice crystals. Their fingers turned stiff and gray. Some of them lost feeling in their hands permanently, the nerves damaged beyond repair by years of handling frozen blocks without any protection. But the sawdust was the secret that made everything work. Tudor had discovered it decades earlier. Ice packed in sawdust could last 18 months or longer without significant melting. A block cut from the Hudson in January could be delivered to a New Orleans restaurant in August still frozen solid. The sawdust acted as an insulating blanket, trapping the cold inside and keeping the warm air out. The science of it wasn't understood at the time. They just knew it worked. Modern physics would explain that sawdust contains millions of tiny air pockets, and air is one of the best insulators known. Each layer of sawdust created a buffer zone where heat transfer slowed dramatically. Pack 12 inches of sawdust around a block of ice, and you've essentially created a primitive thermos that works remarkably well. The ice houses filled during the winter harvest, then slowly emptied throughout the spring and summer as the ice was shipped downriver to New York City and beyond. Barges carried thousands of tons at a time, their holds packed tight with ice and sawdust. The barges moved day and night during the selling season. The ice arrived in Manhattan and was distributed by horse-drawn wagons to homes, hotels, restaurants, and businesses throughout the city. The transformation this brought to American life is hard to overstate. Ice changed what people ate, how they lived, and what was possible in medicine. Before ice, surgery was limited to winter months when wounds were less likely to become infected in the heat. After ice became widely available, hospitals could keep operating rooms cool year-round. Doctors could store blood and tissue samples. Pharmacists could preserve medicines that would otherwise spoil. The infant mortality rate in American cities dropped by nearly 40% between 1850 and 1900. And while many factors contributed, the availability of fresh, uncontaminated food made possible by ice was one of the largest. The American diet changed completely. Before ice, you ate what was local and in season, or you ate preserved food that was heavily salted, smoked, or pickled. After ice, you could eat fresh beef from Chicago in a New York restaurant. You could drink milk that hadn't curdled. And you could enjoy fruits and vegetables shipped from distant states. The Transcontinental Railroad and the ice industry grew together, each making the other possible. Refrigerated rail cars brought California oranges to Boston and Maine lobsters to Kansas City. Beer brewing transformed as well. The lager beers that Americans came to prefer required cool fermentation temperatures that were impossible without ice. Every major brewery in America depended on ice deliveries, and many built their own ice houses to ensure a reliable supply. The brewing industry alone consumed millions of tons of ice per year by the 1880s. By the 1880s, ice had become as essential to urban American life as coal or water. Every neighborhood had an iceman who made daily deliveries, climbing stairs with blocks of ice balanced on his shoulder. Families bought small amounts for their ice boxes, the wooden cabinets lined with zinc that served as primitive refrigerators. Butchers bought ice by the ton to keep their meat fresh. Hospitals stored medicines and vaccines on ice. Morgues kept bodies cold for identification. The entire infrastructure of urban America depended on a steady supply of frozen river water. The Knickerbocker Ice Company controlled most of this supply. They had bought up ice house after ice house along the Hudson until they held something close to a monopoly on the New York market. When the Knickerbocker raised prices, the city paid because there was no alternative. When the Knickerbocker cut wages, the workers suffered because there was no other employer offering better. There was no competition worth mentioning. The company had captured the cold. The men who ran Knickerbocker lived in townhouses on Madison Avenue. They belonged to the same clubs as the Rockefellers and the Morgans. Their children attended private schools and summered in Newport. They never saw the ice harvest except perhaps from the deck of a yacht passing upriver on a summer afternoon. They never felt the cold that their workers endured. In 1887, the Knickerbocker Ice Company recorded revenues exceeding $20 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's more than $600 million today. The company's investors received dividends that made them wealthy beyond the dreams of the men who actually cut the ice. The men who cut their ice still earn $2 a day. The equation hadn't changed. It never does. The ice harvest was a seasonal affair and concentrated into 4 to 6 weeks of intense labor when the ice was right. But the danger wasn't limited to the cutting. Accidents happened throughout the chain. From the frozen river to the city streets, Icehouse collapses killed workers with terrible regularity. The structures were built quickly and cheaply, designed to hold weight but not necessarily built to last more than a few seasons. When the wooden beams rotted from moisture or the foundation shifted under the enormous load of ice, the ice houses came down without warning. Men were buried under tons of ice and sawdust and timber. Some were found quickly and pulled out alive, though often with broken bones. Others weren't found until the ice melted months later, their bodies emerging from the wreckage like terrible offerings to spring. On the delivery wagons, on horses slipped on cobblestones slicked with ice melt, sometimes crushing the drivers beneath them when they fell. The ice blocks themselves were weapons in waiting. A 300-pound block sliding off a wagon could break a man's leg, crush his chest, kill him outright if it struck his head. The icemen who made daily deliveries carried those blocks with iron tongs up narrow stairs into tenement apartments. Their backs bowed under loads that would hospitalize a modern athlete. They did this 20, 30, 40 times a day, year after year, until their spines curved and their knees gave out and they couldn't work anymore. The cold itself was a killer. Hypothermia wasn't something workers talked about because they didn't have a word for it. They called it freezing, or going stiff, or the cold sickness. A man who spent too long in the water or worked too long in sub-zero temperatures would start to shake uncontrollably. Then the shaking would stop. Then he would sit down, suddenly calm, suddenly peaceful. Then he would die. It happened fast. It happened to young men and old men alike. It happened to the careful and the careless both. The companies kept no safety records. There were no inspectors, no regulations, no laws requiring protective equipment or rest breaks or warm shelters. A man who complained about conditions was fired before his words stopped echoing. A man who organized other workers was blacklisted from every ice company on the river. The only protection a worker had was his own caution and the slim hope that luck would stay on his side. Some of them were lucky for decades. Others weren't lucky for a single day. The ice industry reached its peak in 1886. That year, American ice companies harvested more than 25 million tons of ice from lakes and rivers across the Northeast. The industry employed over 90,000 workers directly and perhaps 3 times that number in related jobs, from sawdust suppliers to icebox manufacturers to the thousands of icemen who delivered cold to American homes. Annual revenues exceeded $220 million. The ice trade was larger than the steel industry had been 30 years earlier. It was one of the most valuable commodities in America, this frozen water that cost nothing to make and everything to harvest. And then it began to disappear. The first mechanical ice-making machines had been invented decades earlier, but they were expensive, unreliable, and produced ice that tasted strange, often carrying chemical traces from the ammonia or other substances used in the cooling process. Natural ice was cheaper and better. The companies weren't worried. They should have been. By the 1890s, the technology had improved dramatically. Mechanical refrigeration could produce ice that was cleaner and safer than river ice, which often contained pollutants from upstream factories. Cities were growing, and so was their waste. The rivers that supplied natural ice were increasingly contaminated with sewage and industrial runoff. Outbreaks of typhoid fever were traced to ice cut from polluted waterways. The public began to doubt the safety of natural ice, and their doubts were justified. The machines ran year-round, unaffected by mild winters that ruined natural harvests. Warm winters happened every few years, and when they did, ice prices skyrocketed and supply vanished. Mechanical ice was reliable. It was consistent. And as electricity became cheaper and more widespread, the economics shifted irreversibly. By 1910, a ton of machine-made ice cost less than a ton of river ice. The natural product couldn't compete. In 1900, Americans consumed roughly 15 million tons of ice per year. About 2/3 of that was still natural ice, cut from lakes and rivers by men with handsaws. By 1914, the ratio had flipped. Mechanical ice dominated the market. The great ice companies of the Hudson River began to close their operations one by one. The Knickerbocker Ice Company, which had controlled the New York market for decades, went bankrupt in 1930. Their ice houses rotted. Their conveyor systems rusted into sculpture. The massive wooden structures that had once held millions of tons of ice were torn down or abandoned, left to collapse into the landscape they had once dominated. Within 20 years of the widespread adoption of electric refrigeration, the natural ice industry had essentially ceased to exist. 90,000 jobs vanished. Entire communities that had built their economies around the winter harvest found themselves without work. The skills that men had spent lifetimes developing became worthless overnight. Nobody needed ice cutters when machines could make cold on demand. And America moved on without looking back. We always do. Today, you can drive along the Hudson River and see almost no trace of what happened there. A few foundation stones here and there. An occasional historical marker that most people drive past without reading. The ice ponds where Tudor started his empire have been filled in or built over, replaced by shopping centers and housing developments. The ice houses are gone. The workers are forgotten. But think about what they accomplished. For nearly a century, these men took a natural phenomenon, the freezing of water, and transformed it into a national infrastructure. They built a cold chain that stretched from New England to India, from the frozen rivers of New York to the kitchens of ordinary Americans. They made fresh food possible in summer. They made modern medicine possible because vaccines and blood products require cold storage. They made the expansion of American cities possible because without ice, feeding a population of millions would have been impossible. They did all of this with hand tools and horses and their own bodies. No hydraulic equipment, no heated shelters, no safety nets of any kind. They walked onto frozen rivers in temperatures that would kill an unprepared person in hours. And they worked 10-hour shifts until the ice was harvested or their bodies gave out. The work was brutal. The pay was terrible. The danger was constant and uninsured. Men died regularly, and their deaths were barely recorded. The companies that employed them made fortunes and spent almost nothing on worker welfare. This was the cost of progress. This was what cold required before it became cheap. And yet they built something remarkable. They created an industry from nothing but an idea that seemed insane. They solved a problem that had plagued humanity since the beginning of civilization. It's the problem of preserving food across seasons. They made cold available to ordinary people, not just the wealthy. They changed what Americans ate, how Americans lived, where Americans could build their cities. The ice harvesters of the 19th century were not celebrated in their own time. They were working-class men doing dangerous manual labor for low wages. Society looked through them, not at them. The men who got rich from ice, men like Frederick Tudor and the owners of Knickerbocker, those men were remembered. Their names appeared in history books. Their contributions were honored with statues and street names. The workers who actually cut the ice were anonymous. They still are. But every time you open your refrigerator, every time you drop ice cubes into a glass, every time you buy frozen food or store leftovers for later, you are benefiting from a system that those anonymous workers helped create. The technology changed. The principle didn't. They proved that cold could be captured, stored, transported, and sold. They built the infrastructure and the habits of mind that made modern refrigeration thinkable. And they paid for it with their hands, their backs, their health, and sometimes their lives. The last commercial ice harvest on the Hudson River took place in 1924. A few dozen men cut ice that year, the remnants of an industry that had once employed tens of thousands. They used the same techniques that Thomas Southwick had used 80 years earlier. The same saws, the same horses with their caulk shoes, the same sawdust insulation that Tudor had perfected. The ice they cut was shipped to New York City, where it was sold to customers who still preferred natural ice over the mechanical variety. Old habits die hard. Some people swore the river ice tasted better, cleaner, more real. Within a few years, even those customers had switched. The artificial ice was cheaper and safer. There was no reason to prefer the natural product anymore except nostalgia, and nostalgia doesn't pay the bills. The last ice workers hung up their saws and found other jobs. Some went into construction, Some found work in the very refrigeration plants that had replaced them, trading one kind of cold for another. Some simply retired into poverty, their specialized skills worthless in a world that had moved on without them. The river froze again the next winter, as it always did. The ice formed thick and clean, perfect for harvesting. Nobody came to cut it. Nobody has come since. Sometimes I think about those men in January, walking out onto the ice in the dark before dawn, the cold so intense it hurt to breathe, the knowledge that the work ahead would exhaust them completely. The awareness, never spoken but always present, that any day might be the day the ice broke wrong, or the saw slipped, or the hypothermia set in. They went out anyway. Day after day, winter after winter. They did the work that nobody else would do, because nobody else would pay them for any other work. They built an industry with their bodies and then watched it disappear. We owe them something. Not money, because they're all dead now, and most of them died poor. But acknowledgement, at least. Memory. The recognition that before there were machines to make cold, there were men who harvested it from frozen rivers at risk of their lives. The next time you reach for something cold, take a moment. Think about what it used to cost. Think about the hands that used to do the work your refrigerator does automatically. Think about Thomas Southwick earning $2 to cut 40 tons of ice in temperatures that would kill you in an hour. That's the debt we owe, not to repay it because we can't, but to remember that it exists. The ice formed, the men cut it, the world stayed cold, and now they're gone, all of them, along with the industry they built and the world that needed them. But the cold remains. We have that, at least. We have the cold they gave us, frozen and stored and delivered to every home in America at the touch of a button. We have the luxury of never thinking about where it comes from. They would probably laugh at how easy we have it. They would probably shake their heads at our soft hands and our heated houses and our complete inability to imagine what their work felt like. And then they would probably ask, what took us so long to remember them?